Welcome to Brainwashed, where Jake and I discuss current events from the perspective of two brainwashed, educated adults.
A humanities major and a psychology major tackle the controversial topics of the day through good old-fashioned conversation. All right, welcome back to Brainwash. This is episode 2. Last time we talked about power and oppression through the lens of the Palestine and Israel conflict. This time we're kind of working off that a little bit. I wanted to continue the discussion, but we're now going to focus on critical race theory. Very, very big in the news right now and has been for the past year or so. So we're going to kind of let Jamila take it off on this one, and she's going to give us a rundown of the academic side of critical race theory. And then we'll talk about what the news and what the colloquial version of critical race theory is and its differences between them. Jamila?
Yes, okay. Thank you, Jacob. Yeah, so based on my understanding, I guess it's easier to kind of start with what is critical race theory. I guess that's how my brain works. I'm also going off of some notes here. So essentially, critical race theory is a theory or framework for looking at the world. I really like that. I saw that somewhere in a YouTube video. Someone was like, it's a way of looking at the world. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. So it's a way of looking at the world and how racism plays a role in that world. So essentially, it proposes that instead of racism being made up of single events, of prejudices, of single acts, and one person doing this to somebody else, it's kind of acknowledged as woven into the fabric of society, woven into the structures, government institutions, everyday things, people's everyday lives. So with that being said, in education, when you are in a school or with kids and you're teaching through a critical race theory lens, you're kind of have that in the back of your mind. Like when we're teaching topics, it's not just, maybe on race or whatever. It's not just like racism is one person doing one thing. No, it's actually like in all of our institutions. So which is kind of hard to wrap your brain around, at least for me too. I'm like, okay, what does that actually look like in a classroom? Like, if I'm in a classroom with kids, what does that look like? So I was looking up some like lesson plans and things like that, and also kind of drawing upon my classes that I took in college. And essentially, from my knowledge is that perhaps in an English class, you're reading a set of books. So instead of, reading books only on the Civil War or the Jim Crow era, and you're talking about racism, you look at modern books and you look at, modern books based on modern people in modern day, and you talk about the racism that they experienced in that time and how that plays a role in the current systems and institutions that they have, like whether it's police brutality or, in school, the prison pipeline, and how race plays a role in that. I mean, there's some really great books. There's one called like The Hate You Give is a really popular one for young kids or not kids, but more like young adults to read. So that's just one example of how it would kind of critical race theory would play out in a classroom, I guess. Does that make sense? Hopefully.
Yeah, no, I like that actually. But your previous point, the one on the framing that critical race theory, like it's really what it's all about is the framing and the conceptualizing of these issues in a more systematic way, looking at institutions. That seems to be, as you were describing, more of the focus here rather than what I think a lot of people go to initially when they think of racism is one-to-one conflicts, sort of, you have your classic examples of someone just being explicitly discriminatory.
Mm-hmm.
Critical race theory is kind of giving us a different way of thinking about racism, discrimination, and kind of framing it in a much more broad way, which you noted is kind of hard to think about at first. Yeah, I like that a lot.
Yeah. Well, it's saying that like this is not just what racism is, and like racism didn't end when segregation ended. Like it's saying that,
right.
like, racism is still experienced today by people of color through whether it's schools, whether it's the law system, whether it's through police violence, whether it's through the job market. Like it's not like these single events. It's like kind of this whole structure that's not allowing people, or voters' rights. Like it's not allowing people of color to get access to certain things. And it's saying that like this is what critical race theory is saying, that like it's not just individual acts, it's the broader system, which we talked a lot about as pals, I remember. And it's, you know, we talk about a lot in sociology too. Like it's kind of peeling away that like single act and looking at it as a whole. Yeah, or acknowledging that that happens.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so this that actually gives me kind of a perfect segue. You mentioned our training as pals. And so there we talked about how as student teachers we can teach about, it was called cultural competency, right? So race, gender, xenophobia, things like all that stuff. How we can teach about that in a way that sort of fosters a better environment for our students, right? But we have these trainings. You hosted a lot of them when you were lead pal, Jamila. They were fantastic, of course. But those trainings, I mean, for us, they were mandatory, kind of in a way. But that exact training is now being attacked. So in a lot of government institutions, a lot of even like police academies and things like that, more progressive areas are doing these types of trainings, these cultural man, that's a really hard word for me to say, competency training, if you will. I gotta find a different word for that. But they are now under attack from right-wing media, Republican legislatures. So this is where the dividing line sort of is when it comes to critical race theory. You have what's taught on the academic side, and really what you were just discussing, that like theory, the actual theory of critical race theory, is not taught to elementary schoolers like we're being told, or even high schoolers. Maybe some of it is trickling down, but the reality of the situation is critical race theory is something that was not discussed forever, decades. It was created, I believe, in the 70s at Harvard Law School, and now it is talked about a ton, a huge spike, and it's all coming from right-wing media. Mm-hmm. And the way they look at it is not, they didn't go to this theory and see what the theorists were talking about. Rather, they use critical race theory as like a scary term, and really it just means talking about race. Yes. Exactly. And so the divide is between the academia and the just colloquial version of critical race theory, and the colloquial version is under attack hugely. Mm-hmm. So I have a few examples here. I'll pull those up.
Yeah. Can I say something super quick, because you just reminded me?
Yes.
So, and I think that's, you know, when we're talking about like what's being under attack too, is that like critical race theory is like I said, a way of teaching almost. Like I remember specifically in my reading class, like we would talk a lot about just how important books are. And so like books about race, books about different cultures, like that's almost kind of like critical race theory. Like you're talking about race with young children, or books about, you know, prejudice or discrimination that young children face that I would introduce into a classroom. I'm not sitting here obviously teaching critical race theory, but we're having that conversation. And a critique that I found, and like perhaps, you know, that's kind of where it starts, is, you know, the idea of talking about race in general is extremely touchy. Yeah. And I also have a little quote too. I'm not going to read it right now. We can read it after, that I think outlines that like scariness really well. But yeah, I think, you know, the critique is that like I hear a lot that like it's going to make white children feel bad. It's going to make the kids feel bad about themselves. It's going to make racism more worse, which is probably what you were going to say too, your examples. But yes, yeah. So go ahead.
Yeah, we are jumping right into the thick of it right now. So, all right, let me give a little bit of background here. So we've got Trump in 2020, he issued an executive order that restricted the federal government and its contractors from conducting diversity training that examined systemic racism, white privilege, and other issues involving race and gender bias. So that's like kind of like what we were doing as pals, right? What you were teaching us, right? If we were part of the federal government, that would be a big no-no under the Trump administration after 2020. So thankfully, Joe Biden revoked that on his first day, so that executive order is no more. However, now in June 2021, 25 states have proposed legislation or executive actions banning or limiting the teaching of principles attributed to critical race theory in school. Now, notice that language there, attributed to critical race theory, not actual critical race theory, but it's sort of like a trickle down effect, right? Like you're not teaching the high level academia, but you're teaching stuff that could come from that. And that's where it gets extremely muddy. You'll see that's the huge theme, is everything is extremely muddy, extremely vague. So we have, let's see, in 5 states, right? Idaho, Iowa, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and Texas. They have actually signed it into law. And then 4 other states, they've issued executive rules or memos with a similar purpose. Those are Georgia, Florida, Montana, and Utah. All right, so first thing I got, Iowa. It's called HF 802. And it prohibits governmental entities from, quote, mandatory staff training that teaches, advocates, encourages, promotes, or acts upon stereotyping, scapegoating, or prejudice toward others on the basis of demographic group membership or identity. So that's sort of very similar to the executive order that Trump signed on. So it's almost like the same language is being used by the Iowa
So it's saying
legislature.
You can't talk about these things as a training. Essentially, that's what that's saying.
Yes. So it's talking about mandatory trainings forced on people, talking about, right, XYZ, stereotyping, prejudice, all of these types of things. The mandatory part is also fuzzy because you can have them, like there's a lot of loopholes you'll find in these, and you can have them, but they just can't be mandatory, right? So like it almost defeats the purpose, which is interesting to me, but we'll talk about that later. I don't want to get ahead of myself. So this is also interesting. So they say these attitudes are considered specifically objectionable. So they kind of go through a few things that they really hate about the trickling down of critical race theory, if you will. They say if an individual of a particular race or sex bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same sex or race, that meritocracy or a hard work ethic is racist or sexist, or that any individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of that individual's race or sex. So that was all quoted from the bill itself. So that is what you just mentioned about making white people feel guilty, right? And what worries me is like thinking about being an educator, is if I'm in a state that has law like that says you can't, your school can't hold staff meetings like our pals did, learning about cultural competency and race. And if you teach about these specific attitudes against America, which they might not even be against America, but they're just like within America, but they see it as it, you know what I'm saying? Right. Like then there could be a fine, there could be, consequences to that. And again, this language is all extremely vague and worries me, right? Maybe I could find a loophole. The staff meetings aren't mandatory, they're voluntary. Maybe I could, teach in a certain way that is not problematic for the state that I'm in, but I'm walking on eggshells for sure.
So that legislation, just real quick, essentially it's saying that you can't teach things that are going to make people feel bad, correct? Is that like kind of the layman's term of it?
Yeah, essentially, okay. Yeah. So,
okay.
Yeah, and it talks about other attitudes like, I actually want to go through these because these are really good. So
Yeah.
the first part is that an individual of a particular race or sex bears